The champagne glass shattered against the hardwood floor as my father's words echoed through our family reunion. I'm proud of all my children, except the loser sitting at this table. 23 relatives fell silent, their eyes darting between Dad and me. I forced a smile, my heart hammering against my ribs. For 32 years, I had endured his cruel comparisons to my successful siblings. But tonight was different. Tonight, I carried an envelope that would change everything. I stood up slowly, my hands trembling with anticipation and years of suppressed rage. My name is Ansel Henderson, and I've spent my entire life living in the shadow of perfection. Growing up in suburban Dallas, Texas, our house on Maple Creek Drive was the picture of American success. My father, Robert Henderson, built his fortune in the oil business, and he expected his children to follow suit with equally impressive achievements. My older brother Marcus delivered exactly what Dad wanted when he became a neurosurgeon at 35. My younger sister Sarah exceeded expectations by making partner at one of Dallas' most prestigious law firms before she turned 30. Then there was me, the middle child who chose to teach American history at Jefferson High School. I remember being 12 years old, standing on the auditorium stage in my costume for the school's production of Our Town. I scanned the audience, desperately searching for Dad's familiar face among the hundreds of parents. He wasn't there. Later that night, when I asked why he missed my performance, he barely looked up from his newspaper. Marcus had his regional science fair. That's real achievement, son. Acting is just playing pretend. Those words carved themselves into my young heart, creating a wound that never quite healed. High school graduation should have been a proud moment for any parent. I had earned a 3.8 grade point average and received a scholarship to study education at the University of Texas. Instead of celebrating, Dad spent the entire graduation party telling relatives about Marcus' acceptance to medical school. When someone asked about my plans, Dad waved dismissively. Ansel's settling for mediocrity. Teaching is what people do when they can't handle a real career. College became my escape from his constant criticism, but even then, his influence followed me. While Marcus received full financial support for his medical education, Dad refused to help with my tuition. Teachers don't make real money, he said when I asked for help with student loans. You chose this path, so you can pay for it yourself. I worked 3 part-time jobs throughout college, just to afford textbooks and rent. I waited tables, tutored struggling students, and cleaned office buildings after midnight. Every dollar I earned felt like a small victory against Dad's prediction that I would fail. When I graduated with honors and landed my teaching position, I thought maybe, just maybe, he would finally show some pride in my accomplishment. Instead, he asked when I planned to find a real job. The pattern continued into my adult life. Family dinners became showcases for Marcus' latest surgical breakthrough or Sarah's newest high-profile case. My own achievements, like being named Teacher of the Year or helping struggling students graduate, were met with polite nods and quick subject changes. Dad had a talent for making me feel invisible in my own family. My marriage to Jennifer 3 years ago should have been the happiest day of my life, but even that celebration was overshadowed by Dad's behavior. During his father of the groom speech, he spent 5 minutes praising Marcus' medical career and Sarah's legal victories before briefly mentioning that I finally found someone willing to put up with a teacher's salary. Jennifer tried to be understanding about my family dynamics, but the constant tension eventually wore her down. I can't watch him tear you down anymore, she told me during our divorce proceedings last year. You're an amazing man, Ansel, but you'll never see it as long as you keep seeking his approval. Her words stung because they were true. I had spent decades allowing Dad's criticism to define my self-worth. It wasn't until I started therapy 6 months ago that I began to understand the depth of emotional damage his constant belittlement had caused. Dr. Martinez, my therapist, helped me recognize the patterns of emotional abuse that had shaped my entire adult life. But today, something shifted. This morning, while setting up tables for Dad's 75th birthday celebration, I overheard him on the phone with his business partner, Harold Preston. They were discussing the family gathering, and Dad was bragging about his successful children. Marcus just performed his first heart transplant last week, Dad said, his voice filled with pride, and Sarah closed a $10 million merger case. I raised 2 champions, Harold. I waited, thinking surely he would mention me, even briefly. What about your third kid? Harold asked. Dad's laugh was cold and dismissive. Ansel? Hez the disappointment who never amounted to anything. 32 years old and still playing with children all day. I don't even introduce him as my son anymore. It's embarrassing. Those words hit me like a physical blow, but they also triggered something unexpected. Instead of the usual shame and self-doubt, I felt a surge of clarity. For months, I had been carrying a secret that would shatter Dad's perfect world. I had been waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth, and his cruel words just provided exactly the motivation I needed. The envelope in my jacket pocket contained DNA test results that would change everything. The testing process had started innocently enough when I noticed some unusual coincidences at the school where I teach. But what I discovered would expose a family secret that Dad had hidden for over 3 decades. Tonight, his cruelty would finally catch up with him. The Henderson family estate sprawled across 5 acres of manicured lawns and mature oak trees, a testament to Dad's financial success. By 4 o'clock, relatives had arrived from across Texas, filling the circular driveway with luxury cars and the house with familiar voices. Aunt Margaret and Uncle Frank drove up from Houston with their twin daughters, both successful engineers. Cousin Beth, an architect from Austin, arrived with her husband and their 2 perfectly behaved children. Uncle James and Aunt Patricia flew in from San Antonio, along with their son David, who recently opened his 3rd restaurant. The common thread among all my relatives was success. Real success, as Dad would say. The kind measured in bank accounts and prestigious job titles. I watched from the kitchen window as Dad greeted each arrival with genuine enthusiasm. His face lit up when he saw Beth's latest architectural award, and he spent 20 minutes discussing David's restaurant expansion plans. This was Dad in his element, surrounded by achievers who validated his belief that success was the only measure of human worth. Meanwhile, I helped Mom arrange flowers and set up the dining room, trying to stay useful while remaining invisible. It was a skill I had perfected over the years. Ansel, honey, could you help me with the good china? Mom asked, her voice carrying the slight tension it always held during family gatherings. Linda Henderson was a sweet woman who had spent 45 years walking the delicate balance between supporting her children and avoiding her husband's wrath. As we arranged the formal place settings, relatives began filtering into the house. The conversations followed predictable patterns. Uncle Frank immediately cornered Marcus to discuss his latest medical research. Aunt Margaret gushed over Sarah's recent courtroom victory that had made the local news. Cousin Beth asked everyone except me about their career highlights. When Beth finally acknowledged my presence, her smile was polite but strained. So, Ansel, still teaching high school? Have you ever thought about doing something more challenging? I mean, at your age, don't you want to try for something bigger? Her words carried the same dismissive tone that had haunted me my entire life. The assumption that teaching wasn't real work, that helping teenagers navigate the complexities of history and life, somehow required less intelligence or dedication than designing buildings or performing surgery. I love teaching, I replied quietly. Last month, I helped a student named Maria get into college. She's the first person in her family to graduate high school, and she's going to study engineering. Beth nodded absently, already looking around for someone more interesting to talk to. That's nice. David, tell me about your new restaurant concept. The conversation moved on without me, as they always did. I excused myself to check on the catering setup, needing a moment away from the suffocating atmosphere of measured achievement. In the kitchen, I found myself watching the catering staff prepare the elaborate dinner Dad had ordered. The head caterer was a young Hispanic man, probably in his early 30s, with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of hard work. His name tag read Diego, and something about him seemed familiar, though I couldn't place why. What struck me as odd was Dad's interaction with Diego. Throughout my life, I had watched Dad treat service workers with polite indifference at best, often with barely concealed condescension. But with Diego, his demeanor was completely different. "How's your family doing, son?" Dad asked Diego, his voice warm and concerned. It was a tone I rarely heard him use, especially with employees. "They're doing well, Mr. Henderson. Thank you for asking," Diego replied, his English carrying a slight accent that suggested Spanish was his first language. Dad reached into his wallet and pulled out several bills, far more than a normal tip. "Here, take this for your family. You work hard, and you should take care of yourself." Diego accepted the money with obvious gratitude. "Thank you, sir. You're very kind. You remind me of someone very special," Dad said, his hand briefly touching Diego's shoulder. Someone who taught me the value of honest work. The interaction lasted only a few minutes, but it planted a seed of suspicion in my mind. In 32 years, I had never seen Dad show such spontaneous kindness to a stranger. The way he looked at Diego, the genuine affection in his voice, the unexpected generosity. It all felt significant in a way I couldn't yet understand, but I was beginning to suspect it connected to the secret I had been carrying for the past 3 months. My investigation had started accidentally back in February, when I was helping a student research her family genealogy for a class project. Maria Sanchez was the same girl I had mentioned to Beth, a brilliant young woman whose father had worked as a groundskeeper for wealthy families before starting his own landscaping business. During our conversations about family history, Maria mentioned that her older brother Diego sometimes catered events for their father's former employers. The coincidence seemed minor, until Maria showed me an old photograph of her father, Roberto Sanchez, from his groundskeeping days. The man in the picture bore a striking resemblance to me. Same facial structure, same build, even similar mannerisms that I recognized from looking in mirrors. Curious, I asked Maria more questions about her family. Roberto had died the previous year from cancer, but before his death, he had told his children about a period in his life when he worked for a wealthy oil executive in North Dallas. Roberto had been discreet about the details, but he mentioned developing feelings for someone he couldn't have and making choices he sometimes regretted. The timeline matched perfectly with my birth 32 years ago. The location matched our family's address during that period. And when Maria mentioned that her father always spoke warmly about a woman named Linda who had shown him kindness during difficult times, the pieces began falling into place. I spent weeks debating whether to pursue my suspicions. Part of me feared what I might discover, but a larger part needed to know the truth about my identity. In March, I quietly ordered a DNA testing kit and submitted my sample along with a hair follicle I retrieved from Roberto Sanchez's gravesite during a private visit. The results arrived last week, confirming what I had already begun to suspect. Robert Henderson was not my biological father. Roberto Sanchez was. Suddenly, everything about my life made sense. The constant criticism, the emotional distance, the feeling that I never quite belonged in my own family. Dad hadn't been cruel because he was disappointed in me. He had been cruel because every time he looked at me, he saw evidence of his wife's infidelity. But the DNA test revealed something else, equally shocking. Diego Sanchez and I shared enough genetic markers to indicate we were half-brothers, both sons of Roberto Sanchez. Now, watching Dad treat Diego with the warmth and respect he had never shown me, I realized he knew exactly who Diego was. The guilt and sadness in his voice when he spoke about someone very special suggested he had genuine regret about Roberto's death, and perhaps even some understanding of the injustice he had inflicted on me throughout my life. The irony was devastating. Dad could show fatherly affection to Roberto's other son, but not to the child who had lived under his roof for 3 decades. Tonight, that hypocrisy would finally be exposed. Dinner was announced at 7 o'clock, and the family gathered in the formal dining room that Mom had decorated with Dad's favorite colors, burgundy and gold. The mahogany table could seat 24 people comfortably, and tonight every chair was filled. Dad sat at the head of the table, naturally, with Mom to his right and Marcus to his left. Sarah sat next to Marcus, followed by her husband and their 2 children. I found myself at the far end of the table, between Cousin Beth and Uncle Frank's wife, Patricia. The seating arrangement wasn't accidental. In the Henderson family, your distance from Dad's seat directly correlated to your perceived importance. I had grown accustomed to being relegated to the family's periphery, but tonight the symbolism felt especially pointed. The meal progressed through multiple courses, each more elaborate than the last. Dad had spared no expense for his 75th birthday celebration, and the conversation flowed as freely as the wine. Stories were shared about family vacations, business deals, and professional achievements. The atmosphere was warm and jovial, exactly what Dad had intended for his milestone birthday. After the main course, Dad stood and tapped his crystal wine glass with his knife. "Marcus, your work in cardiac surgery is saving lives every day. You've made our family name synonymous with medical excellence." Marcus beamed with pride as relatives nodded approvingly. "Sarah, your legal career has been nothing short of spectacular. Watching you argue cases and win justice for your clients makes me prouder than words can express." Sarah blushed with pleasure, her husband squeezing her hand supportively. Frank, your engineering firm has built half the bridges in Texas. Margaret, your volunteer work has helped countless families. Beth, your architectural designs are reshaping Houston's skyline. Each family member received their moment of recognition, their contribution to the family's collective success acknowledged and celebrated. I waited for my turn, even though experience had taught me not to expect much. Perhaps he would mention my teaching career briefly, or acknowledge my recent Teacher of the Year award. Maybe he would reference the scholarship fund I had established for low-income students, or the tutoring program I ran on weekends. But as Dad's speech continued, it became clear that my turn wasn't coming. He systematically praised every adult family member except me, moving seamlessly from one achievement to the next without even a glance in my direction. The omission was so obvious that relatives began exchanging uncomfortable glances. Finally, Aunt Margaret, Dad's younger sister, couldn't ignore the elephant in the room any longer. Robert, what about Ansel? You haven't mentioned his teaching career. I heard he was named Teacher of the Year at his school. The silence that followed her question was deafening. Dad's face tightened almost imperceptibly, and I could see him calculating his response. He had been caught in his deliberate exclusion, and now he had to decide whether to acknowledge me or double down on his cruelty. He chose cruelty. Well, Margaret, since you asked, Dad said, his voice taking on a harder edge, I suppose I should address that. He turned to look directly at me for the first time that evening, his eyes cold and dismissive. I am proud of all my children who have achieved real success. Marcus saves lives. Sarah wins justice for her clients. They've made something significant of their lives. The pause that followed felt eternal. I could feel the blood rushing to my cheeks as I realized what was coming next. But I can't pretend to be proud of mediocrity. Some people are born to achieve greatness, and others are born to settle for less. I'm proud of all my children, except the loser sitting at this table. The words hit me like a physical blow, but what made them even more devastating was the reaction they provoked. Instead of shocked silence or expressions of sympathy, several relatives actually chuckled. Uncle Frank smirked and shook his head as if Dad had made a particularly clever joke. Cousin Beth covered her mouth to hide her smile. Even some of the younger family members snickered behind their napkins. My life's work, my dedication to education, my impact on hundreds of students over the years, all of it reduced to punchline status for their entertainment. Dad, Sarah said, her voice sharp with disapproval. That's completely uncalled for. Ansel works hard, and teaching is important. But Dad waved off her objection dismissively. Sarah, darling, you're successful enough to be generous. But let's not pretend that babysitting teenagers requires the same intelligence and dedication as surgery or law. Ansel chose the easy path, and he's living with the consequences of that choice. Marcus remained completely silent, unwilling to risk Dad's displeasure by defending me. His cowardice hurt almost as much as Dad's cruelty. The laughter around the table continued, growing more confident as Dad's attitude gave everyone permission to join in the mockery. I felt my cheeks burning with shame and anger, my hands clenching involuntarily under the table. For 32 years, I had endured his criticism in private. But this public humiliation in front of our entire extended family felt like a new level of cruelty. But as I sat there absorbing the laughter and whispers, I noticed something that gave me strength. Through the kitchen doorway, I could see Diego standing frozen with a serving tray in his hands. His eyes were filled with tears, and he was staring at the scene with obvious anguish. In that moment, I realized he understood exactly what was happening. He had witnessed the same kind of dismissal and disrespect from wealthy employers, and his empathy for my situation was written clearly across his face. Our eyes met briefly, and in that instant, I saw recognition. He knew we were connected somehow, just as I had suspected. The DNA test results in my jacket pocket suddenly felt like a weapon of justice rather than just a family secret. Dad was still basking in the laughter his cruel joke had generated, completely unaware that his entire world was about to crumble around him. It was time to reveal the truth. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a sound that cut through the lingering chuckles around the table. The movement was deliberate and controlled, a stark contrast to the emotional chaos churning inside my chest. Every eye in the room turned toward me, some still smiling from Dad's cruel joke, others beginning to sense that something significant was about to happen. "Excuse me," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "Before we finish this celebration, I have something for Dad." I reached into my jacket pocket and withdrew the manila envelope I had been carrying all evening. The paper felt substantial in my hands, weighted with the power to change everything. I had rehearsed this moment in my mind dozens of times over the past week, but now that it was actually happening, the reality felt surreal. Walking around the table toward Dad's chair felt like moving through thick water. Each step was deliberate and measured, giving me time to absorb the confused expressions on my relatives' faces. Marcus frowned slightly, probably wondering if I was about to make some kind of scene. Sarah watched with concern, her protective instincts clearly activated by my unusual behavior. Mom's face had gone pale, her maternal intuition apparently warning her that whatever was in that envelope would not be good news. Dad watched my approach with a mixture of annoyance and curiosity. He was probably irritated that I was interrupting his moment of triumph with some kind of dramatic gesture. In his mind, I was likely about to make an even bigger fool of myself in front of the family. I placed the envelope directly in front of him, my hand steady despite the enormity of what I was about to reveal. The envelope was addressed simply, "For Robert Henderson. Happy Father's Day." "For you, Dad," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent dining room. Happy Father's Day. The irony of the Father's Day reference wasn't lost on anyone in the room. We were celebrating Dad's birthday in November, making the holiday greeting seem oddly out of place. But I had chosen those words deliberately, knowing their significance would become clear soon enough. I turned and walked toward the dining room entrance, my footsteps echoing in the absolute silence that had fallen over the room. At the doorway, I paused and looked back at the table one final time. Dad was staring at the envelope with obvious confusion, clearly debating whether to open it immediately or set it aside for later. The rest of the family was watching the scene unfold with the fascination of spectators at a car accident. Through the kitchen doorway, I could see Diego still standing with his serving tray, but now he had moved closer to get a better view of what was happening. Our eyes met again, and I saw understanding beginning to dawn in his expression. He sensed somehow that whatever was in that envelope would affect both of us. "Well, aren't you going to open it?" Uncle Frank asked, his voice breaking the tense silence. What could be so important that it couldn't wait until after dinner? Dad shot him an irritated look but picked up the envelope. His thick fingers worked at the sealed flap while the entire room watched in anticipation. I could hear Mom's sharp intake of breath, as if she was preparing herself for bad news. The envelope contained 3 items: the official DNA test results, a letter I had written explaining how I had discovered the truth, and a photograph of Roberto Sanchez that Maria had given me. Dad pulled out the DNA report first, his eyes scanning the technical language and genetic markers. I watched his face carefully, seeing the exact moment when comprehension hit him. His confident expression crumbled, replaced by shock, then anger, then something that looked almost like fear. His hands began to tremble as he read the conclusive statement at the bottom of the report. Probability of paternity, 0%. Robert Henderson is not the biological father of Ansel Henderson. "What is this?" he whispered. But his voice was loud enough for everyone at the table to hear. He pulled out the photograph next, and I saw his face go completely white. The image showed Roberto Sanchez during his younger years, and the family resemblance between us was unmistakable. Anyone looking at that photograph would immediately understand why I had ordered the DNA test. Then came my letter, which Dad began reading aloud in a voice that grew increasingly strained with each word. "Dad, for 32 years, I believed you were my father, and I spent those years trying desperately to earn your love and approval. Your constant criticism and dismissal made sense once I learned the truth about my parentage. Roberto Sanchez was my biological father, a man who worked as your groundskeeper from 1991 to 1993. I suspect you've known the truth all along, which explains why you could never love me the way a father should love his son." Dad's hands were shaking violently now, his face cycling through multiple emotions as he processed the information. But he hadn't reached the most devastating revelation yet. At the bottom of the letter, I had included one final bombshell. The DNA test also revealed that Diego Sanchez, your catering supervisor tonight, is my half-brother. We share the same biological father. I find it interesting that you can show him the kindness and respect you never offered me. Perhaps because you don't have to look at him every day and remember Mom's betrayal. Dad's scream of rage filled the entire house, echoing off the high ceilings and causing several relatives to jump in their chairs. The sound was primal and devastating, the voice of a man whose carefully constructed world had just collapsed around him. "Linda," he roared, turning toward Mom with fury blazing in his eyes. "Linda, what have you done?" Mom's wineglass slipped from her trembling fingers, adding another crash to the chaos that was rapidly engulfing our family gathering. The red wine spread across the white tablecloth like blood, staining everything it touched. Her face had gone completely pale, and she was gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles were white. "Robert, please, let me explain," she whispered. But Dad was already on his feet, his chair toppling backward with a thunderous crash. "Explain. Explain." Dad's voice was raw, with 3 decades of suppressed rage. "You had an affair with the gardener, got pregnant with his bastard child, and let me raise him as my own son for 32 years. What could you possibly say to explain that level of betrayal?" The extended family sat frozen in their chairs, witnessing the most devastating family secret being explosively revealed. Uncle Frank's mouth hung open in shock. Aunt Margaret covered her face with her hands. Cousin Beth grabbed her children and tried to shield them from the verbal violence erupting around the dining table. "It wasn't supposed to happen," Mom sobbed, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Roberto was kind to me when you were always traveling for business. You were never home, Robert. Never. I was lonely and scared and pregnant with Marcus, and Roberto showed me compassion when I needed it most. So you slept with him," Dad screamed, his face turning purple with rage. "You destroyed our marriage and made me into a fool in front of my entire family." Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out weak and uncertain. "Wait, if Ansel isn't your son, then he's not really my brother." Sarah rounded on Marcus with fury. "Has been your brother for 32 years. A piece of paper doesn't change that." But even as she defended me, I could see the shock and confusion in her eyes as she tried to process the revelation. "Ansel has been my son in every way that mattered," Mom continued through her tears. "I loved Roberto, yes, but I chose to stay with this family. I chose to raise Ansel with you because I thought you would love him too." "Love him." Dad's laugh was bitter and cruel. "Every time I looked at that boy, I saw your betrayal staring back at me. Every time someone said he looked like me, I had to smile and pretend while knowing he was another man's child living in my house, spending my money, carrying my name. The truth was finally out, and it was even more devastating than I had imagined. Dad hadn't just suspected I wasn't his son. He had known for certain, probably from the moment I was born. My entire childhood of emotional abuse suddenly made horrible sense. He hadn't failed to love me because I was disappointing. He had deliberately withheld love because I was living proof of his wife's infidelity. Uncle Frank, who had always been Dad's closest confidant, cleared his throat nervously. "Robert, I have to ask, did you know, all these years, did you know Ansel wasn't yours?" Dad's silence answered the question more powerfully than words could have. The rage seemed to drain out of him, replaced by a bone-deep weariness that made him look every one of his 75 years. "I suspected from the beginning," he finally admitted. "Linda was different after Roberto started working for us, happier, more confident. And when Ansel was born, he looked nothing like Marcus or Sarah, nothing like me. But I had no proof, and the business was growing, and I thought maybe I was imagining things. But you never got a DNA test to find out for sure?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying a mixture of disbelief and disappointment. "I didn't want to know for certain," Dad said quietly. "As long as there was doubt, I could pretend our marriage was still intact. As long as I didn't have absolute proof, I could maintain the illusion that our family was legitimate." The confession hung in the air like a toxic cloud. For 3 decades, Dad had chosen willful ignorance over truth, allowing his suspicions to poison his relationship with me, while never taking the steps necessary to either confirm or dispel his doubts. His cowardice had created a hell for both of us, but Uncle Frank wasn't finished with his questions. "So you took out your anger on an innocent child. You punished Ansel for something he had no control over." For the first time in my life, I saw something that might have been shame cross Dad's face. I tried to love him. In the beginning, I really tried. But every milestone, every birthday, every family photo was a reminder that my wife had been unfaithful. The resentment just grew and grew until I couldn't hide it anymore. From the kitchen doorway, I heard a chair scrape against the floor. Diego had been listening to the entire conversation, and now he was walking slowly toward our family gathering. His face was a mixture of sadness, anger, and something that looked like recognition. "Excuse me," Diego said, his voice respectful but firm. "I don't mean to interrupt, but I think I need to say something." Dad spun around to face him, and for a moment, they stared at each other in silence. The resemblance between Diego and me was obvious now that we were both in the same room, and I could see Dad making the connection that had been staring him in the face all evening. "You're Roberto's son," Dad said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir. Roberto Sanchez was my father, and if what I just heard is true, then Ansel is my half-brother." Diego's voice was steady, but I could see his hands shaking slightly. "My father told me before he died that he had another son with a family he worked for. He said he made mistakes he regretted, but he never stopped loving that other son." The room fell completely silent as everyone processed this new information. The catering supervisor they had barely noticed was actually part of our family drama, another son of the man whose affair had destroyed Dad's marriage and warped my entire childhood. "Roberto spoke about Ansel?" Mom asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Diego nodded, his eyes finding mine across the room. "He followed your life from a distance. He knew about your teaching career, your marriage, your divorce. He was proud of the man you became, especially your work with students who needed extra help. He said you had his heart for helping people who were struggling." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. While Dad had been withholding love and approval, my biological father had been quietly watching and feeling pride in my achievements. Roberto Sanchez had seen value in my teaching career, had recognized the importance of the work I was doing with at-risk students. "Why didn't he ever contact me?" I asked, my voice breaking slightly. "He wanted to," Diego replied. "But he knew it would destroy your family and hurt you even more. He thought you were better off believing Robert Henderson was your father, even if that relationship was difficult." Dad made a sound that was part laugh, part sob. "So Roberto Sanchez was more of a father to Ansel than I ever was, and he never even spoke to him." The truth of that statement settled over our family gathering like a shroud. In trying to preserve the illusion of our perfect family, Dad had inflicted decades of emotional abuse on an innocent child, while the man who could have provided the love and acceptance I craved had remained silent to protect me from further pain. The irony was devastating, but it also meant that the worst part of this nightmare was about to end. I was no longer Robert Henderson's disappointing son. I was Roberto Sanchez's child, and according to Diego, Roberto had been proud of me all along. "I think we should go," Diego said quietly, walking over to where I stood near the dining room entrance. "Let your family process this privately. We can talk somewhere else." I nodded, grateful for his suggestion. The dining room had become a battlefield, and I needed space to think clearly about everything that had just been revealed. "You're right. I need some air." As we headed toward the front door, Sarah called after me. "Ansel, wait. Don't leave like this. We need to talk about what this means for our family." I turned back to look at my sister, this woman who had defended me even as her world was crumbling around her. "What family, Sarah? I just found out I'm not really part of this family. And honestly, after 32 years of being treated like an outsider, maybe that's for the best." "You'll always be my brother," she said firmly, tears running down her cheeks. DNA doesn't change 32 years of shared memories. Her words meant more to me than she could know, but I needed time to process everything before I could have that conversation. "I know, Sarah. But right now, I need to understand who I really am." Diego and I left the house together, walking past the luxury cars in the circular driveway toward his catering van parked on the street. Behind us, I could hear Dad's voice raised in anger again, probably continuing his confrontation with Mom about the affair that had shaped all our lives. "There's a diner about 2 miles from here," Diego suggested. "We could get some coffee and talk without anyone listening." 20 minutes later, we sat across from each other in a vinyl booth at Mel's all-night diner, 2 cups of coffee cooling between us while we tried to make sense of our connection. Diego looked exhausted, and I realized he had been working all evening while dealing with the same emotional shock that had overwhelmed me. "Tell me about our father," I said. "Tell me about Roberto." Diego's face softened as he began sharing memories. He was the kindest man I ever knew. He worked construction and landscaping jobs to support our family, But he never complained about the physical labor or the long hours. Every evening, he would come home tired and dirty. But he always had time to help me with homework or teach me how to fix things around the house. What was he like as a person? Patient, gentle. He believed education was the key to a better life, so he pushed all of us kids to take school seriously. When I struggled with reading in elementary school, he spent hours every night helping me practice, even though English wasn't his first language either. I felt a pang of grief for all the conversations we would never have. Did he ever mention me specifically? More than you might think, Diego replied. He kept track of your teaching career through the local newspapers. When you won Teacher of the Year, he cut out the article and kept it in his wallet. He used to say that you inherited his passion for helping people learn and grow. The knowledge that Roberto had been proud of my achievements filled a hole in my heart that I didn't even realize existed. For years, I had sought validation from a man who could never give it to me, while my biological father had been silently celebrating my successes from a distance. Did he ever regret the affair? Diego considered the question carefully. He regretted hurting people, especially you. He said the worst part was knowing that his choices had made your life harder. But he never regretted loving your mother. And he never regretted that you existed. He just wished he could have been part of your life without causing more pain. We sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, both of us processing the magnitude of what we had discovered. Finally, Diego pulled out his phone and showed me a photograph. This was taken about 6 months before he died, he said. He was at my daughter's birthday party. The man in the photo was older and grayer than the Roberto I had seen in Mariah's pictures, but the resemblance between us was unmistakable. We had the same eyes, the same smile, the same way of holding our heads when we were thinking. Looking at that photo was like seeing what I might look like in 20 years. I have something else to tell you, Diego said, his voice becoming serious. Something about Roberto's will. I looked up from the photograph, surprised. His will. He left money and property to his other son to be held in trust until that son could be found and the inheritance claimed. The lawyer has been trying to locate you for the past year, but Roberto only knew your first name and that you lived with the Henderson family. The revelation stunned me. How much money? Enough to change your life if you wanted to. Roberto's landscaping business became very successful in his later years. He saved everything he could, hoping someday he would be able to help you financially. I felt tears welling up in my eyes as I realized the depth of Roberto's love for me. While Dad had been criticizing my career choices and questioning my worth as a man, my biological father had been working to ensure I would have financial security. There's more, Diego continued. Roberto left detailed letters explaining his relationship with your mother and his hopes for your future. He wanted you to know that he never stopped thinking about you or caring about your well-being. The enormity of Roberto's love and sacrifice overwhelmed me. He had given up his chance to be my father in order to protect me from the scandal his presence would have created. He had watched me struggle with Dad's emotional abuse while knowing he could offer the love and acceptance I desperately needed. And through it all, he had worked to provide for my future, even knowing he might die before we ever met. I want to read those letters, I said. I want to know everything about him. I'll give them to you tomorrow, Diego promised. But right now, we should probably go back to your family's house and finish this conversation with Robert Henderson. The thought of facing Dad again made my stomach clench, but Diego was right. The truth was finally out, and we needed to address the damage that 32 years of lies and resentment had caused. Are you ready for that? I asked. Diego nodded. We're brothers, Ansel. We face this together. When we returned to the house, we found the extended family gathered in the living room, while Dad and Mom continued their argument in the kitchen. The relatives looked shell-shocked, their elegant evening having devolved into a Jerry Springer episode none of them had anticipated. Several were preparing to leave, clearly uncomfortable with the family drama they had witnessed. Aunt Margaret approached me as soon as we walked in. Ansel, honey, I'm so sorry. We had no idea Robert had been treating you so badly because of this situation. If we had known, it's not your fault, I assured her. None of you knew the truth. Uncle Frank joined the conversation, his face grave with concern. What are you going to do now? Where does the family go from here? Before I could answer, Dad emerged from the kitchen, his face haggard and his shirt wrinkled. The confident patriarch who had been holding court just 2 hours earlier looked broken and defeated. Mom followed behind him, her eyes red from crying. "Ansel," Dad said, his voice hoarse from shouting, "we need to talk." Diego and I followed them into Dad's home office, a masculine space filled with oil industry awards and family photos. Ironically, several of the photos included me, frozen moments from a childhood that had been built on lies and resentment. "I owe you an apology," Dad began, but I held up my hand to stop him. "No, you owe me more than that," I said, my voice steady and confident. "You owe me an explanation for 32 years of emotional abuse. You owe me an accounting for all the ways you destroyed my self-worth and made me question my value as a human being." Dad sank into his leather chair, suddenly looking older than his 75 years. "I was angry, Ansel. Every day, I looked at you and saw Linda's betrayal. I know that wasn't fair, but I couldn't help myself. You could have gotten a DNA test years ago," I pointed out. "You could have divorced Mom if her affair was unforgivable. You could have made choices that didn't involve destroying an innocent child's self-esteem." "I was a coward," Dad admitted. "I was afraid of losing the family completely, so I chose to stay and punish everyone instead of facing the truth and making hard decisions." Mom spoke for the first time since we had returned. "I should have told you the truth, Ansel. I thought protecting Robert's pride was more important than protecting you from his resentment. I was wrong, and am sorry." I looked at both of them, these people who had shaped my entire worldview through their choices and their cowardice. "Your apologies don't undo 3 decades of damage. They don't give me back the childhood I deserved or repair the relationships that were poisoned by your lies." "What do you want from us?" Dad asked. "I want you to understand that your treatment of me was abusive and inexcusable," I said. "I want you to acknowledge that my career is valuable and meaningful, regardless of how much money I make. And I want you to treat Diego with the respect you should have shown me all along." Diego had been listening quietly, but now he stepped forward. "Mr. Henderson, I appreciate the kindness you've shown me tonight, but I can't accept your generosity while knowing how you've treated my brother. Ansel deserves better from all of us." Dad looked between Diego and me, seeing our physical resemblance, and perhaps finally understanding the full scope of what his anger had cost our family. "You're both right. I let my pain turn me into someone I don't recognize. Ansel, you've become a good man despite my failures as a father, not because of anything I contributed to your life." The admission was more than I had ever expected to hear from him, but it still wasn't enough to repair our relationship. "I forgive you, Dad. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean pretending the past didn't happen or that we can suddenly have a normal father-son relationship." "What does it mean?" he asked. "It means I'm releasing the anger I've carried for so long because that anger was hurting me more than it was hurting you," I explained. "But it also means I'm setting boundaries. I won't tolerate disrespect or criticism about my life choices. I won't attend family gatherings where my worth is questioned or diminished. And I won't pretend that everything is fine just to maintain the appearance of family harmony." Mom wiped her eyes with a tissue. "What about us? What about our relationship? We can rebuild something new," I told her, "but it has to be based on honesty and mutual respect. No more secrets. No more protecting one person's feelings at the expense of another's well-being." Over the next hour, we had the most honest conversation our family had shared in 32 years. Dad acknowledged the specific ways his behavior had damaged my self-esteem and apologized for each incident I could remember. Mom explained the circumstances of her affair with Roberto and her decision to stay in her marriage despite her feelings for him. They both committed to treating me with the respect and dignity I deserved as their son, regardless of biology. Marcus and Sarah joined us eventually, both wanting to understand how this revelation would affect our relationships. Sarah reaffirmed her commitment to our sibling bond, while Marcus admitted he had been too afraid of Dad's disapproval to defend me when I needed support. They both welcomed Diego as part of our extended family and expressed interest in learning more about Roberto's life and character. But perhaps the most meaningful part of the evening came when Diego and I made plans to visit Roberto's grave together the following weekend. We would bring flowers and spend time learning about the man who had given us life and loved us from a distance. Diego promised to share Roberto's letters and teach me about our Mexican heritage, while I offered to help him navigate Roberto's will and ensure he received his fair share of the inheritance. 6 months later, I used Roberto's inheritance to establish the Roberto Sanchez Memorial Scholarship Fund, providing financial assistance to first-generation college students pursuing careers in education. The fund had already helped 12 students attend college, carrying on Roberto's belief that education was the key to a better life. Diego and I had developed a close relationship, talking every week and spending holidays together with his family. His children called me Uncle Ansel, and I had finally experienced the unconditional love and acceptance that had been missing from my childhood. Through Diego, I learned about Roberto's values, his work ethic, and his deep commitment to helping others succeed. My relationship with Dad had evolved into something more honest and respectful, though it would never be warm or affectionate. He had genuinely changed his behavior, treating me with courtesy and showing interest in my teaching career. But 3 decades of damage couldn't be repaired overnight, and we both understood that our connection would always be complicated by the pain of our shared past. The most important change was in how I saw myself. I was no longer Robert Henderson's disappointing son, struggling desperately for approval that would never come. I was Roberto Sanchez's child, inheriting his passion for education and his commitment to helping people overcome obstacles. My teaching career wasn't a consolation prize or a sign of mediocrity. It was a calling that honored my biological father's belief in the transformative power of learning. The truth had set me free from a lifetime of seeking validation from someone who could never provide it. Instead, I had found my identity in the values and dreams of a man who had loved me enough to sacrifice his own happiness for my well-being. Roberto Sanchez had been more of a father to me than Robert Henderson ever was, and he had accomplished this miracle without ever speaking a single word to me directly. His love had been patient, selfless, and enduring, the kind of love every child deserves from their parent. That understanding changed everything about how I moved forward in my life. I no longer measured my worth by Dad's standards, or sought approval from people who were incapable of appreciating my contributions. I knew who I was, whose son I was, and what kind of legacy I wanted to build with my own life. Have you ever discovered a truth about your family that completely changed how you understood your childhood? Sometimes the most painful revelations can also be the most liberating, helping us finally understand who we really are and where we truly belong. I'd love to hear your thoughts about family, identity, and the courage it takes to confront difficult truths. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like to let me know you connected with Ansel's journey. Subscribe for more stories about finding strength in the face of family challenges and the power of truth to heal old wounds. And please share this with someone who might need to hear that their worth isn't determined by other people's inability to see their value. Thank you for listening to this story about discovering identity, setting boundaries, and learning that sometimes the family that truly loves us isn't necessarily the one we were raised with. I hope Ansel's journey reminds you that your worth is inherent and that you deserve relationships built on respect, acceptance, and genuine love.